Welcome to the Well Club, where the journey to wellness begins. Take a deep breath, open your mind, and join us as we explore the endless possibilities of well-being. Here's Dr. Rob Douk.
Hello, my guest today is Suneel Gupta. He lost his Dharma and then found it again. He's a tech entrepreneur and a visiting scholar at Harvard. He writes a lot of this Dharma topic on his latest book called Everyday Dharma. Drawing from his personal journey in ancient Indian wisdom, he offers 8 practices to help readers balance ambition with well-being and find true fulfillment. Suneel, welcome to the Well Club.
Dr. Rob, good to be here.
So good to have you. I've been excited to speak with you today. Before we get into more about Dharma and the 8 practices, there's so many topics I want to cover, but let's take it all the way back. You know, as children of refugees, our parents' journeys have shaped who we are today. And I'd love to kind of have you share your incredible mom's truly inspiring story.
Yeah, Mom grew up in a time when it was probably her best path out of poverty was to meet, a man and try to marry him and get herself into a better sort of place. She grew up with no running water, no electricity, but that path wasn't right for her. She knew that she wanted something different. She wanted something more. And so she started to teach herself how to read. And came up with the idea that she wanted to move to America and become an engineer with Ford Motor Company, because Ford Motor Company was sort of the Google of its day. It was the big company that everybody sort of knew about, even a tiny girl in a tiny village. What happens next is pretty extraordinary. Her village ends up creating a collection pot. And people put little pennies, little rupees into the collection pot. And eventually it grows large enough for her to get on a boat and for her to get to the United States, where she gets a scholarship to Oklahoma State University. And the day after she graduates, she gets herself to Detroit, Michigan, where she applies for her dream job. And she gets herself into a room with a hiring manager. Now, the problem was that this hiring manager, he saw the name, Damayanti, at that time, Hingorani was her name, maiden name, and had no idea whether it was a man or a woman, assumed that it was a man because it was men that were applying for those jobs back then. But when he gets into the room, he realizes that it's a woman. And he says to her, look, I'm sorry, we actually don't have any female engineers who are working here right now. And it's this really sort of deflating moment for Damayanti, for my mom, because, all of her dreams, she can sort of feel slipping out of her hands. So she picks up her resume, she picks up her purse, and she begins to walk out of the room. And before she turns the door handle, she decides, like, if it's not now, then when's it ever going to be? So she turns around and she summons all the energy, all the courage that she can. And she looks this hiring manager in the eyes and she tells him her story about all the sacrifice that it took for her to get to this country, to get to this city, to get to this room. And then she says, look, if you don't have a female on staff, you don't have any female engineers here, well, then do yourself a favor and hire me now, because we can go build that team together. And over the next half hour or so, they have this exchange where this hiring manager is so inspired that he goes out and he fights with his colleagues, he fights with his bosses. And in 1967, she becomes Ford Motor Company's first female engineer.
Incredible. Oh my goodness. I actually talk quite a bit about that in my intellectual wellness within the 9 dimensions. I have a similar story about how I come from a place where my college counselor profiled me as, you're probably not going to make it to college right out of the gate. But I didn't accept that. I started negotiating with no, but I still wanted to go to a UC. I grew up in California, and that resiliency to those circumstances is just so amazing to hear her story. How has that, Suneel, rubbed off on you and your success growing up in a household like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, because the way that I grew up was so different than the way that she grew up. I grew up in almost this boring suburb of Michigan, where things were so much better, so much different. But I think the quality that she made sure that both my brother and I had was what I now call the game of now. The game of now. And the game of now is different than the game of someday, because with the game of someday, you're waiting for courage in order to take action. So courage leads to action. But with the game of now, it's the reverse. You don't wait for courage in order to take action. You take action and you let courage catch up along the way. And the reason that that matters is because when we look at her story, I mean, oftentimes it can be very easy for me to say, well, look, she was able to take this journey because she was courageous. And the truth is that she was, but that courage didn't start up front. It was action after action after action. And every single time she took action, courage caught up along the way. And the more that I've been out there now as a researcher, what I do is I study great leaders. I travel around the world. I unpack the habits that took them to the top of their game. The more I realized that I had this mistaken perception that the people who end up reaching the top of their game are there because they're brave. They're naturally brave people. They're naturally courageous. And the more I kind of realized that that's not true. It's simply that they decided that they wanted to go do something and they didn't necessarily have courage. They weren't necessarily brave, but they did it anyway. And that's just the thing. I mean, as you know, neuroscientists will call this behavioral activation, right? We want to create a behavior, or we want to feel something in order to do something, but it works the other way too. We can do something in order to generate that feeling. And so 3 friends from design school, they were not ready to start Airbnb, right?
Right.
Clearly not. They didn't have the skills necessarily to be a CEO, to found a team like that, and certainly to manage other people. They'd done none of that, but they just did it, and courage catch up along the way. Ben and Jerry, who I spent a lot of time with for the last season of the show that I host for Amazon Prime. It's very clear to me that when they started that company, they had zero business experience. They had zero experience as entrepreneurs. But they decided that they were going to go do it, and they encouraged caught up along the way, right? Greta Thunberg, another example, I think great one, who has literally built this massive environmental movement. She's been nominated for 3 Nobel Prizes, but she's a teenager, right? Like, if we were going to go pick somebody to lead the movement, we probably wouldn't go looking for a teenager with no experience with this. But the fact is that she's done it, and she's done it brilliantly because she just did it. She took action and let courage catch up along the way. So this game of now is something that I feel like I learned from my mom. And when I think about what's the change I want to see in the world, I want to see more people playing the game of now.
That's so inspiring. And, that takes me right back to it. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but it reminds me a lot of my parents as refugees, and how my mom smuggled me out of the concentration camp that claimed 2 million lives in Cambodia. She
Wow.
smuggled me out with,
Wow.
placed me on her right hip I was only 2 months old. So she considers me the miracle baby, right? And she's climbing over, you know, uh, boulders and everything to get to the Thailand borders. And so when I read about your mom and how she taught herself to read, and one of the first books was the Ford Motor Company and being inspired, it really is just action. And then when you look back in retrospect, you're like, oh my goodness, look what I just did. And so, yeah, that's so good. How are you now, you know, being born into a household like that? You have two daughters, right? So how
Yeah.
how do you simulate some of this to promote that resilience? When it's not that they're growing up in a village and having to face some of these circumstances that forces them to take that kind of action.
Such a great question, because I think about it all the time. In some ways, I really feel, and I wonder if you feel this way too, is I feel like I'm a bridge in some ways between the values that my parents had and what my kids will end up sort of inheriting, right? So it's about how do we sort of pass on resilience, even if we were born and raised in very different environments and they have to deal with very different things. What I've sort of come around to is that that doesn't necessarily need to be, a refugee story to put this stuff into practice. Like my daughter is about to start middle school tomorrow morning, and she's so nervous
Right.
about it right now, right?
That's
I
a
mean,
scary time.
It's a scary time. I mean, she's about to go from this elementary school that just has a couple of hundred kids. The school now is like almost like a feeder for all the elementary schools in the area. So she's about to like, be in a school with thousands of kids now, right? And it's just it's a pretty intimidating thing for her. But I think this idea of, instead of trying to wait until you're in this state, or instead of trying to create a feeling that allows you or gives you permission to go do that thing, to go do it and realize that being scared is okay. In fact, it's actually part of the journey, like it's part of the experience. I think that we can get into trouble sometimes when we start to feel like there's something wrong if we're uncomfortable, right? Or there's something wrong if we feel scared. And I think it's very easy to condition ourselves to feel that way,
That's right.
right? But I think this idea of how do we get really comfortable with being uncomfortable, I think that in the end of the day is what probably allowed your mom, your family to do what they did, was that they were able to find little ways that even when the world felt like it was caving in around them, they were able to find these little solaces of comfort. So I want to be able to pass those along to my daughters as well. There's an activity that we do. It's really simple, and it comes from Dr. Kristen Neff's research. So she wrote the book Self-Compassion, which is still kind of one of the books that I refer back to a lot. And one of the tools inside the book is what she calls the soften, soothe, allow meditation. And it's a very quick one, but what she basically says is every time you feel that level of discomfort inside of you, there's a tendency for us to want to push that out, right?
Right.
Because we don't want it to belong, right? But whatever we resist persists, right? Whatever we push against grows stronger inside. So rather than trying to push out that uncomfortable emotion, that pain, the discomfort, whatever it is, the soften, soothe, allow meditation, what it allows you to do is just go, like, actually locate where that is in your body. Where do you feel it the most? Is it in your belly? Is it in your chest? And I will literally guide my daughter through this. I'll say, put your hand on that spot. Where do you feel this discomfort in the sphere about middle school? Go find that spot. And instead of trying to push it out, soften around it, right? Step one, soften around it, right? Step two, give it some love, soothe it, right? So literally just talk to it. Say, hey, you know what? I know this is scary right now, but I've got you. And step three is allow. So just allow for it to be there. Create space around it, allow for it to be there. And we will do that. We will do that exercise, soften, soothe, allow. We'll do that sometimes, like, Matt, it's like a couple times a day, because she's constantly encountering these new situations where she's like, I don't know about this. I don't know about playing lacrosse. I don't know about singing that song in front of my friends. I don't know about going to middle school. So there's constantly these things where we can start to apply, I think, probably some of the same things that my mom was applying when she was on a boat to this foreign land called America, where she had no money when she arrived, didn't know what was going to happen on the other side, but still the tools that she used can still be used today.
Absolutely. And what a great training ground. And I would go a step further from just the discomfort to even embracing failure in these stages. What better time to learn it now? And
Yeah.
I'm guilty as a dad of three, right? As a we parent our kids, and oftentimes we try to protect them from some of these, but it's oftentimes when they don't make the team,
Right.
as hard as that is, and they don't make the cut when their other friends have gone on to have those kind of conversations to build resiliency and really character building. That, I think,
Yeah.
are the skills that's going to really, I wanted to send them off to college with, right? And I mean, you call yourself the face of failure, but I just love your approach to this. I love how vulnerable you are, and the humility that you bring. It really opens up a pathway for people to engage you and have a discussion about this, because most of the time with failures, we try to sweep that under the rug and hope nobody sees
Yeah.
it, let alone talk about it. Can you
Yeah.
share a bit about that, and how you've, gosh, not only embraced it but have used that a little bit as a platform to open up a healthy dialogue about failure?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there was a story written in the New York Times about 10 years ago. It was 2014, and it was about people who fail. And my face was the cover of that story. And the reason for that is because I had started two companies that had not worked. And then I'd helped start up Groupon, which was this hero of a company for a while, and then it had this massive decline, lost 99% of its market value. So it literally went, in the eyes of Wall Street, it went from hero to zero. And so later on, I went on to start a company called Rise, and that was the one that worked. But I had gone through 3 failures, and the New York Times does this article. They choose my face as sort of like this face of failure, and the article goes viral. And there was a point in time when you could have Googled the word failure, like that's it, just search the word failure, and my face would have been like your top search result. Um, and so like, I would joke about it at the bars with my friends. Like we would all kind of like, I would accept like sort of like I would try to make as much light of it as
Yeah.
possible. The truth is that it really stung because I wanted to be perceived as successful, right? Like I wanted my friends, I wanted my family to see me as a success. And now every time they looked at my name, it was going to be synonymous with failure. And, it was really my mom, actually coming back to her, that, I talked to a bunch of people around this time. I was kind of digging my head in the sand. And my mom kind of reminded me that all these people that I admired probably had failure stories as well. And the quote that she kind of gave to me was that long term success often comes from these short term failures or embarrassments. So if you can do something with it, if you can learn something from it. And so I started to use this article as a way to actually forge conversations with people that I really admired. I would literally send this article to people who had no idea who I was, but I admired them. These were Oscar winning filmmakers, these were celebrity chefs, these were coaches of professional sports teams. I'd find their email address and I would email them a link to the article, and I would say, hey, as you can see, like I don't really know what I'm doing, but I would love to get some advice. I'd love to learn more about your journey. And the response rate to that email was like way higher than I would have thought it would be. And it just paved the way to some of these early conversations. And I have not stopped having those conversations. It's been over 10 years. I've now had, hundreds of in-depth conversations and moments of study of what I think are some of the most exceptional people on the planet. And it's all because of that article. Like that article, which I thought was an embarrassment, ended up becoming this massive gift because it just set me on this path where now what I do for a living is I study people who have been able to break through in their own lives, and oftentimes through failure, to unpack, what were the habits that really allowed them to do that.
Speaking of exceptional people and people you admire, you went back to your roots and spent some time with Grandpa. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how he opened you up to this world of Dharma?
Yeah, yeah. One of my earliest memories is being 7 years old, sitting on my grandfather's porch in New Delhi. And my grandfather, he was just like this legendarily large Indian man. Like he was bald, glasses, and just this giant figure. The first time I heard the word bodhisattva, the first person I thought of was my grandfather. He just like exuded this spiritual energy, but he was also a man of very few words. And my favorite thing to do was just sit there on the porch with him in silence, looking out at the streets of New Delhi. We watched the streets come alive, usually very early in the morning. So like, we would see fruit cart vendors, we would see rickshaw drivers who were like firing up their engines. We would see, the streets, cows ambling to pastures. Like for me as a kid from suburban Michigan, this was like a really wild
Oh, yeah.
thing to take in, right? And so I'd sit there and he'd be sipping on his chai, and one day he, again, man, a few words, but one day he breaks his silence and he points to an Indian flag that is waving in the distance. And he says, hey, do you know what the center of the Indian flag represents? And so I look at it and I see the colors of the flag. And in the center, there's this navy blue wheel. And he says, that is the Ashoka chakra, or the wheel of Dharma. And what he says to me is that as I get older, he's telling this to a 7-year-old kid. He says, as you get older, life has a way of speeding up. Every year is going to feel just a little bit faster than the year before it, right? Until the wheel is spinning faster and faster and faster. He's like, when you get to my age, it's spinning so fast that, years are going by just like that and that. He's like, and you have to pay attention to not getting yourself to the outside of the wheel, not falling to the outside of the wheel, but staying on the inside of the wheel, because at the inside of the wheel, the center is who you really are. That is your Dharma. So knowing knowing when you're connected to that place, knowing when who you are and what you do are in alignment, and noticing when it's not in alignment so that you can bring yourself back to the center of the wheel. That was one of the last conversations that my grandfather and I ever had. We'd spoken over the phone after that a couple of times, but I never saw him again. And for me, like as an American kid or an Indian kid growing up in America, growing up in a pretty white suburb, I kind of distanced myself from, anything that felt sort of Hindu, uh, or frankly, felt brown. Like I wanted to be perceived like as white as possible, and that included anything having to do with religion or my roots. I kind of wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted to separate myself from that. But throughout my life, that conversation, that moment with my grandfather continued to call at me. I mean, literally, like I would be, in the middle of my dreams, I would wake up having seen him sitting next to me on a porch, pointing to that Indian flag, and it just continued to call at me. And eventually, uh, as somebody who felt pretty lost in my life as well, I said, "What does this philosophy of Dharma? What does it really mean? And what can it offer me right now?" And that's when I started to get really curious about it, and decided to pursue writing this book.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's so fundamental to all, even within my nine dimensions of wellness. When you talk about wellness and well being, and you're looking at career wellness to physical wellness to spiritual wellness, I think this is so integral. And you mentioned a lot about outer and inner success, and like the arrival, fallacy. I certainly experienced that firsthand. I slaved over and built my first company.
Yeah,
I had I sold a company, and then I thought it was all bliss. I thought it was all, just gonna be just amazing. And, I actually found myself in a really dark place shortly after, because my identity was so wrapped up into the role that I was playing there, who I was as a clinician, as a CEO. And it took me a long time to kind of navigate through what is this that I'm actually encountering, and why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing, and why hasn't it turned out the way that I thought.
yeah,
And we talk about the false idea that money cannot buy meaning, and you start to really go down this rabbit hole of really exploring now more inwardly, who is my true identity. And I think it has a lot to similarities of what you're talking about with this dharma concept. And so, can you talk a little
yeah.
bit about, like how how you view outer success and inner success and this whole interplay?
Yeah, I mean, so the arrival fallacy was coined by Dr. Tal Ben Shahar, who, basically said, look, when we sort of are conditioned to believe that we're going to reach this moment of arrival, when we're going to feel complete, we're going to feel sort of this lasting sense of joy. We're going to finally have enough money in the bank. We're going to finally have enough status, enough respect in the eyes of our peers, where we're finally going to feel like, hey, we're good now. And of course, that never happens, right? As soon as we hit one milestone, the goalpost moves again. And that can be for big things. It can be for smaller things as well. It could be getting that next deal, or getting the next promotion, or getting the next car, whatever it is. But we feel like these things that are supposed to bring us more of a lasting sense of happiness, they're actually quite short lived. They're actually quite temporary. And the result of this is that we constantly find ourselves on this almost hedonic treadmill, where we're constantly pursuing this next thing. And that can be exhausting, right? Now, does that mean that we abandon our drive? Does that mean that we don't want goals in life? Absolutely not. And goals are what I think give us fuel. They make us sort of thrive. They give us something to aim for, and there's something very healthy about all of that as well. And then the question is, where are we deriving our sense of joy and happiness? Is our sense of happiness and joy being derived from hitting those milestones, or is it being derived from something else? And that is the difference between outer success and inner success. So if outer success is the achievements, it's the hitting of the goals, it's the earning of the money, then inner success is really about sort of the joy of having done the thing in the first place. It's the day to day, it's the everyday, the nitty gritty, and even, even the stuff that doesn't sometimes seem as pleasant. Can we find a sense of joy even in those moments as well? And, that's not always an easy thing. That is candidly what I struggled with, right? Like when I was running my company, this time the company that actually worked, I was in the grind of the day to day, but what was sort of keeping me going was this idea that we was going to hit this moment when we were going to be able to exit the company and we were going to be able to get it to a certain scale. And that's the thing that sort of fueled me. But I have to say, it was very cheap fuel, meaning every single day felt like a grind. I was wearing myself into the ground. And if I look back on those 3.5, 4 years when we were building up the company, they weren't very enjoyable. And sure, the end was a good result, but I could have enjoyed that time so much more with a different lens on how I looked at like what was the process of it all. Like this idea of enjoying the process.
Right.
And by the way, like isn't it amazing how like, all this stuff that we hear about even on like the sports fields here in the West are like echoed into like ancient Eastern wisdom. Like we're all saying the same thing, which is that, as cliche as it sounds, it is about the journey. It's not about the destination. But what I hoped to do with the book was to really sort of break that down to some very, very fundamental techniques. What are some things that we can put into practice right away to actually be able to derive success every single day, to feel like we're experiencing joy and success again, even through the things that don't necessarily go our way?
Yeah. Maybe start to unpack some of that for us as it relates specifically to wellness and well-being, because it's very loaded, and it takes
Yeah.
us to wellness and well-being.
Yeah. So, chapter 3 of the book is called prana. And prana is it's Sanskrit for energy, right? Our source of energy. And some people will describe it as your life force. And you know, the reason that it matters in the context of what's happening today is that it seems like so many of us are running out of this prana. We're running out of energy. In fact, when I compare leaders and teams who are able to build momentum in their lives and in their careers, and I compare them to people who kind of fizzle out, they don't quite reach their potential. The people who don't reach their potential, very rarely do they run out of time or talent or even resources. What they almost always run out of is energy. And they just simply don't have enough gas in the tank to keep doing what they're doing, right? And 70% of the workforce right now says they're languishing, meaning they're experiencing high degrees of stress, low degrees of energy. 40% of C-suite leaders say they are considering leaving their jobs in the next 12 months because they're exhausted, right? Like they have more relationships, they have more wisdom, they have more experience, they have more of all these things that we feel like are essential to great success. But the one thing they have less of is energy, right? They're out of fuel, right? So we can sort of look at prana, this energy, as really a bridge from where we are to where we want to be. And if we don't have it, we can't go to where we want to go. And so one of the things we have to learn how to do as whether you're an individual contributor, you're a creator, whether you're a leader, is we have to learn not only to manage our time, but we have to learn how to manage our energy. Wh- One of the practices inside the book that I offer is what I call taking rhythmic renewal, which means that you're not waiting for vacations or long breaks in order to restore yourself, because we've kind of been conditioned to do that. We will burn ourselves to the ground and then we'll go on a 2-week vacation to try to restore ourselves. But that is actually a pretty weak way of dealing with burnout. Like vacations are wonderful. They're a great way to see the world. That could be a great way to spend time with friends and family. But as an instrument for burnout, it's actually pretty weak because most people say they experience more stress 1 week after vacation than they did 1 week before vacation. So you sipping a pina colada on the beach, fantastic. But then like you get back to the grind and it feels almost even worse. And so the much better instrument for dealing with burnout is this idea of taking little short rests throughout the day, every single day. When I sat down with Martha Stewart, and she's 82 years old, and she's literally got the energy of a 22-year-old. And the way that she does it is she's taking these little breaks throughout the day. She's gardening, she's horseback riding,
Right.
she's taking walks around her property. She's doing little things to break up the day. And she works these 16-hour days at the age of 82. She goes to sleep late, she gets up early, but that's how she does it. And we notice this as a pattern. In fact, the average high performer that we study, across all different walks of life is taking somewhere around 8 breaks every single day, like, which I know sounds extraordinary, but the model that I use, and I've helped other people bring this into their life because it's so simple, is what I call the 55-5 practice, 55-5 model, which is that for every 55 minutes of work, whenever possible, you're building in 5 minutes of focused, deliberate rest, 55 to 5. Now, it's not always possible. You're not going to be in the middle of a critical meeting and 55 minutes is up and you get up and walk out of the room. But most often, what we find is that even the people who have the most demanding schedules, instead of a 60-minute block, they could do whatever they needed to do in 60 minutes and 55 minutes, right? Instead of a 60-minute meeting, they could do a 55-minute meeting. And then they could use those other 5 minutes to restore themselves. And what the science tells us is that each of those 5 minutes is going to make the other 55 minutes far more productive, far more creative. You're going to have much more energy. And that energy, by the way, is going to spill over to the other people in the room as well.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we talk about this all the time when we're looking at the autonomic nervous system and, moving from the state of fight and flight and that stress response to getting to a state of relaxation. And essentially what you're doing is a healthy dose of just pounding that in throughout your day, you know. Much like, I mean, someone can also say, I want a beach body, and they've never worked out all year, and 2 weeks before you work out, they're just feverishly running on the treadmill. It's not gonna really do it for you, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I love that concept. And, I think this whole Dharma concept too, as you talk about this, it really combats burnout in today's fast-paced, world. And I think it really segues into so many practical tools when it looks at emotional and mental resilience and everything kind of wellness related. Talk to me about, you also have an 85% rule that I think helps with this a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Carl Lewis, who was this Olympic sprinter, world record holder. Um, what they would find about Carl Lewis is that he would run very differently than the other sprinters, meaning that there was a pretty much a general rule that if you weren't sort of at the top of the pack by halfway through the sprint, you had a very low shot of finishing first place. So, people who sort of were pounding it out the gate, winning out the gate were the ones who were most likely to win the whole race. Carl Lewis had that sort of backwards. He would always kind of start near the back of the pack, but he would advance and usually win the race. And they couldn't figure out sort of why. And so there was a coach who decided to study Carl Lewis really effectively, like study his every movement, all of his behaviors. And what he realized is that Carl Lewis was generally starting the race at 85%. He was continuing the race at 85%, and he was finishing the race at about 85%. So he was very consistent throughout the whole thing. So while other runners were coming out the gate strong, but they were kind of in some ways like burning out, trying to use more fuel to sort of get them across the finish line, Carl Lewis was very smooth and very consistent, and he was at 85%. I started to think about sort of how do I start to bring this into my own life? Because I always feel like, if I'm not giving myself 100% towards something, then I'm not doing enough. But the problem with that is that if I'm constantly giving 100%, I eventually get to a point in time where I'm like, all right, I'm done, and I got to drop down to like 20, 30% for like a long period of time. I burn out, right? And then hopefully I'm able to rebuild my tank and come back to 100% again. But what would it look like if I was consistent at 85%? And I got to say, this is one of those things that has really changed my life. When I started to kind of look at it that way, I started to kind of breathe more easily when I'm looking at my job. I started to have more fun. I'm like, what? I'm going to just dial this to 85% and I'm going to go, and I'm moving. I'm focused, I'm dialed in, but I'm not intense, right? And that extra intensity that I thought would serve me, I didn't realize was such a handicap for me, because not only internally was it making me feel fried, but by the way, it was also expanding to people around me as well. If I would walk in, as an example, when I was leading teams with my company, and I'd walk into a room and I had this really intense stare about me, and my fists were clenched, and my sort of like I was determined, and my teeth were gritty. That's not necessarily a creative environment to be part of, right?
That's right.
It might be a driven environment to be part of, but that only lasts so long. And as I started to kind of relax a little bit, what I started to measure was A, how was my own well-being, but B, also like what was happening to productivity. Was like my worst fears really coming true that if I dialed it down by 15%, we were going to slow down as a company or slow down as a team, or our product was going to become inferior? No, none of that. None of that happened. The only thing that happened is that I was able to go for longer, more consistent periods of time. I was enjoying my work more. People were enjoying being around me. And this guilt of having dialed it down from 100 to 85 started to evaporate.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so good because it when you think of the number 85 out of 100%, I think most of us can conceptually give ourselves the permission to kind of stop there and understand that it's optimal as long as we can maintain that consistency. So there's a lot of freedom in that, you know.
So
I actually
much.
remember my for my bachelor trip we hiked Half Dome, and I had, and there's a dozen of us, right? So you have all different styles of hiker. You've got people who train, people who didn't train at all. And I remember one fella, I won't mention his name, but he was 100% full throttle because he felt genuinely, if I just slow down just a bit, I'm going to get too tired and I'm not going to make it up there. But sure
Right.
enough, he cramped up a quarter of the way up there, to no one's surprise. But mentally, he learned a valuable lesson. So I think if he were to hear this snippet and soundbite on 85, he'd be like, "Yes, absolutely, go after the 85, because then you can sustain that and make it to the top." And so that was a regret of his. Yeah.
Well, he's going to demand another hike to Half Dome now after hearing this.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's a good excuse to get back up there. But I mean,
Yeah.
I think this is so good for you mentioned creativity. I talk a lot about creative wellness too, and actually the healing power of creative wellness. And there were like, many of us are created to be creative beings. And when we think of being creative, it's not just the artists that normally come to mind, the musicians and the painters, but the ability to be entrepreneurs requires a lot of creativity. The ability to hit a good golf shot when you're in trouble requires a lot of creativity. But if you're burnt out and you're at 100%, you're probably unlikely to sustain the consistent flow of what you need to be, producing. And so just and again, it kind of comes back to this beautiful idea of the inner and outer success. It's almost like an inner movement of success that we really have to breed into this culture, that it's very tempting and so easy to look at the outer success because that's what everybody sees. So we mask ourselves and we take care of our bodies, and we feed our minds with a lot of, books and get the intellectual wellness in, but then there's a matter of the human spirit much deeper that I feel like it's often missing in that conversation, and why I in neurobiotheology really try to bridge the three, because we feel like all three needs to be there for full well-being. Like, what good is it to be well but not really holistic well-being at the forefront of it all? And I think bringing that into the workplace is so important. So when we haven't really fully heard your definition of dharma, we've talked about it at length. What's your kind of simple explanation of how one should view dharma?
Yeah. The simple definition is the alignment of who you are and what you do. When you are bringing who you are to what you do, whatever that thing is, you are in your dharma, right? And so it doesn't mean, you have to go do anything that is extraordinary, or even, something that you believe is extraordinary. It can be done in everyday events. The way that I literally clean up the dinner table, after we're done as a family dinner, I can be in my dharma doing that, because I'm bringing who I am, the spirit of who I am, to that act of clearing dishes. Um, and so when we feel those two things are aligned, we start to come alive in a brand new way. And again, these everyday things can start to have more meaning for us because we're bringing ourselves to the equation. But we on the flip side, you could have the most exciting, extraordinary job in the world
Right.
and feel like you are not bringing who you are to what that is, right? So a lot of the leaders that I coach right now are on paper extraordinary, right? I mean, some of the most sought after people, in business, but they're not quite happy with what they're doing, right? And part of the reason for that is because who they are and what they do each day, they don't feel like they're in alignment. And in some ways, and we talked about creativity here just a minute ago. I kind of look at this as a sort of like, an old old-fashioned transistor radio, where you sort of had to tune the channel, right? You had to tune it just right in order to receive, right? And if you did it just right, you would receive the right signal and you would be giving the right signal, right? And you, in some ways, are the radio, right? And your job is to tune things the right way, right? And part of the reason that we talk about things like the 85% rule, slowing it down just a little bit, is because if we're too entrenched, when we're too focused, too intense, the channel, the frequency is just off, right? So we're getting stuff done, but we're not necessarily playing the type of music that we want to be playing. We're not receiving the type of information and signal that we want to be receiving. And so sometimes these little tweaks can sort of be like magical. You're literally turning the knob just a little bit and you start to realize, oh, like this can feel a lot better. This thing that I'm doing, I don't have to leave it. I don't have to abandon my life in order to transform the way that I live. I can make these little tweaks. So, like, just for example, for me, one of the things that became apparent is like I wasn't spending enough time listening, and not just listening to others, but listening to myself. So when I started a journaling practice, I would literally sit down in the mornings and I would write one thing at the top of the page. And that one thing was, what will you have me know? And I don't even know who I was really talking to, right? Was I talking to God? Was I talking to the source? I was talking to something that was not me, but I just wrote, what will you have me know? And the words would just start to flow. They would just start to flow. All this advice would come to me. And it was about relationships, not just with my work, but it was relationships with my wife, with my kids, the way that I engage with my community. All these insights would come to me. And all I needed to do was I needed to listen. So just tuning for me, this act of journaling was just tuning this knob just a little bit. It was literally 15 minutes each morning doing that, would tune it a little bit so that I could actually receive the right signal. And then as I was receiving the right signal, then all I needed to do was open the channels. If I opened the channels, I could start expressing that in a much more authentic way. Same job, same deadline, same meetings, but I was bringing more of who I was to what I do.
The concept of this dial and you journaling reminds me a lot of these ancient practices that we can now kind of resurrect and bring into, modern wellness practices, through apps and what have you. There's a lot of great aids out there, and we're building a platform
Yeah.
now for that. But, how does spiritual spirituality play a role in your practice daily? What role does that play in meditation and prayer and in hearing things clearly and being in the right frequency?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the way that it plays a role for me is really just the whispers. Like, I feel like I'm constantly being spoken to, and I know it's not me. Like, I know it's not like as simple as the mind coming up with ideas and like I just feel these things that come to me. My first book was a book called Backable, and it was all about how to get other people to believe in your ideas, right? And the reason that I wrote that book is because I feel like when we come up with an idea, in some ways I feel like it's a gift that is being bestowed upon you, right? In some ways, like an idea that you get really excited about, it hits you. And oftentimes when I ask people, like, how did you come up with that? It's not like they sat down and wrote down like a bunch of things that eventually like led to this. It wasn't an equation that they came up. It was like an inspiration, a moment of motivation or inspiration. And so the point being that like, either you believe that that was like, just purely cognitively created, or you believe that also there's some external influence here. And I happen to believe the latter, right? I believe that we, as smart as we are, ideas come to you. They organically come to you, and then you become a vessel for those ideas. And the question is, what kind of vessel do you want to be? Especially the ones that really appeal to your heart, the ones that really sort of motivate you, and you're like, oh my God, I really want to see that exist in the world. Then you become a vessel for it. And so, the point being, again, coming back to the channels, is like opening yourself to the whispers. Because I think that as soon as you start to tune into those, and maybe even sort of leave room for the possibility that it's not just you that's coming up with these things, but these things are almost being presented to you like little gifts. And then the question is, how do you want to share those gifts with the world? That to me is my spiritual practice.
Yeah. I think that's incredible because and it's not often spoken, I think, enough about because it's a practice that can really unlock years of hardship or years of work, like with the right inspiration that can come from that journal. You can put a team together, do all the R&D you want, but with a spiritual breakthrough or spiritual thought or that whisper that you're speaking of, you could be far, accelerating this concept of yours. And so kind of going back to the workplace, I interview the practice that I talk about this in my first book, the Fearless Socialpreneur, are my three P's, which is I look at passion. I genuinely want to know how these whispers are interplaying in a person's mind and what they're into, whether that be something very creatively bent or leadership focused. And then from passion to really looking at, well, what do we do with those passions? Is there actually a purpose for you right now? Which I think is kind of like when you talk about Dharma and that alignment. And I see myself as a role as a coach or a CEO when I'm building teams as someone who can maybe come alongside and build a plan to be a dream releaser, to have them exercise those passions and really live into their purpose. Because I think when those are aligned, I can agree with you more. I think people do come alive because they're living into it. And it's not always fun, right? There's a lot of grit and resiliency that you have to kind of go through and oftentimes a lot of failure as part of that process. But to live into listening to that whisper, listening to that call, I think there's something so powerful about the human spirit that then comes alive.
Yeah, and I love that, man, because I think when those things are aligned, you know, win or lose, you're advancing every single day, because it's something that you care about, right? And if you care about it, arguably, I mean, I sat down with Bill Gates for part of my research, and one of the things that he said is like, success is a lousy teacher, right? And we learn we as you know, like we learn the most from our failures. And if the goal isn't necessarily only to win, but the goal is to grow, like I want to become something, right? Then I think every single experience, no matter what, win or lose, becomes grist for the mill, right? It's all useful.
I love that you also talk about after kind of my burnout phase, after selling the company and kind of going through my own slight depression and kind of coming out of that and really pursuing wellness and well-being. What does that really mean and where did I miss the mark? I am oftentimes hearing the whisper is, hey, it's time for you to play. Play responsibly, but play. I'm like, what is that really what I'm hearing? Not just to build another empire, not to, solve this issue within a society. No, it's just to play because I think play, when you think about, I mean, children learn language through play. Things are developed through play. There's a lot of healing in play. And so I've really delved into the science of play. And it really shows how resilient we are too when circumstances don't work out our way, that we're still able to do date nights with our wives and be connected. I pickleball with a group of people every Sunday. I
Nice.
need that. So that's my gauge. And sometimes being out surfing reminds you that some of your problems, as big as it feels when it's just bottled up inside your own head, you get out into that vast ocean and somehow it kind of just melts away. It kind of reminds you that, you're probably okay. You're going to live to figure this out for tomorrow again. Talk a little bit about that, Sunil. Like you talk about work and Dharma and the importance of play and that interplay and how sometimes they're indistinguishable, if you did it just right.
Yeah, yeah. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was the author of Flow, uh, wrote a lot about this. Ultimately, what he said is like we have these two sides of our sort of work experience when we're trying to tackle a project. We have our autotelic side and we have our exotelic side. The exotelic side is really focused on the achievement. It's focused on like what's that finish line sort of look like, and the autotelic side of us is focused on what happens between here and there, right? And the play really comes from that autotelic side, right? It comes from sort of like the day to day. And like what Csikszentmihalyi ultimately concluded is that we have this mistaken belief that people who are the most successful in life are the people who are just focused on the end goal. They're focused on like, eye on the prize. But the people who are able to find a sense of play with the autotelic side of things, this day to day sort of what we might call the grind, but other people can call like the play, the journey, the experience. There were many success stories from that column as well. And by the way, it's a much more enjoyable journey. Alan Watts would talk about sort of this idea of, he would compare this to music. And what he basically say is like, look, we don't listen to a song in order to listen to the last note of the song, right? Right? Otherwise, it would literally be like one note, right? And that's the end. The whole point of music is to go through the experience of the song, right? And so in the book, I write about sort of taking that into what I call the music mindset, having a music mindset where when you're going into something, it's about every note of the experience that you're trying to create. Like you're creating a composition, right? And yes, at the end of the composition, there probably is a note, right? There may be a closer to this composition, but you're not living for that. You're starting to experience joy from what's happening between here and there. So finding like little ways to have fun with what you're doing is really, really important. I wrote in the book about this runner. Her name is Dina Castor, who loved running as a kid. It was something she really, really enjoyed. But as she became more competitive, got into high school and eventually college, she burnt out because her focus had shifted almost entirely from the act of running to the act of winning. And so she quit. And she was like somebody who everybody regarded as like, she's going to be one of like America's great runners. And she left. She left the entire sport. And finally, a coach named Joe Vigil came around, and he ran the Mammoth Running Club. And he came around and they connected, and he introduced her to a brand new philosophy. And what made Vigil really interesting as a coach is he had gone to places like Africa and he had studied how they ran. And what he realized is that while in the United States, we focused a lot on the numbers and on the metrics, they were kind of focused much more on like the joy of running. And he wanted to bring that to runners in the United States as well. So he literally did away with the numbers and the metrics. And he said, I want you to have like as much fun as you possibly can out there. That's what we're going to focus on. We're going to bring you back to the joy of running. And I know for a fact that we bring you back to the joy of running, you're going to run longer, you're going to run harder, you're going to run faster. That's exactly what happened. She became she got back into the sport. She ended up becoming the fastest marathon runner in US history for a woman, and ended up breaking all sorts of records, and it all came back to this joy of running. Now, how do we apply this in our day-to-day lives? Because there are so many like little tasks throughout the day where I'm like, well, I'd rather not do that task, right?
Right.
But what I have challenged myself to do is literally to ask myself a question, which is, how do I have fun with this? Yeah, I would literally just ask myself before I walk
Yeah.
into a meeting I don't want to walk into. I just ask myself, how do I have fun with this? And
Yeah.
typically, Rob, the answer will come to me. It
Right.
just will.
Yeah.
Just by asking myself, by opening that channel of awareness, how do I have fun with this?
Yeah.
Something will come up, right?
You're
And
looking for
I've
it.
been
Yeah.
I'm looking for it. I'm open to it, and
Right.
the answer will come. And it's bizarre because there are situations where I feel like this is going to be devoid of joy no matter what I do. But I simply ask myself, how do I have fun with this? And something will come to me that won't necessarily make it the most pleasurable experience ever, but it will make it so much more like joy filled than it would if I just treated it like, well, this is just something I've got to do.
Yeah. I love that. I love it. All right, my friend. Well, I have both of your books here. Is there anything that you left out or wish you would have expanded, or a third book perhaps that you're working on right now in the making that you want to share?
Well, I think we should end where we began because we talked about the game of now. And I think so many people out there right now are playing what we've been taught, which is the game of someday, right? We wait for courage, we wait for readiness, and then we take action. And the challenge with that, as we all sort of know, is that we can't necessarily take time for granted. Like we don't know how much longer we're going to have. We can never be certain about that. And so, if you're listening and if anything I said resonated with you, my encouragement is just play the game of now. Like if there's something out there that your heart is calling for, something that you're being called to do, Don't fall into the trap of believing that you need to wait for courage in order to take that move. Take the move, take action, and let courage catch up along the way, because it always will.
Yeah, it reminds me, if you follow your calling, those whispers, you will be equipped along the way. It just happens that way. And
Yeah.
oftentimes we think we have to go prepare, we have to go and train and do all these things before that. Yeah, I love that. And Sunil, for our listeners, how do they get a hold of you and get involved in what you're up to?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, just go to my website. It's just suneelgupta.com, and you'll find access to newsletters and to some more information and links to the books, anything you need, and also my contact information is on there as well. Feel free to reach out.
Sunil, so good to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Rob.
This has been The Well Club. Remember that wellness is not a destination, but a continuous path of growth and self-discovery. To learn more about Dr. Rob Douk, go to drdouk.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and always remember to nurture your well-being. The Well Club is a production of Forbes Books.